Chapter 4. Ali Rodolphe, or the Involuntary Turk. Ostracized by a churlish landlord, Rodolphe led for a time a nomad life, doing his best to perfect himself in the arts of sleeping supperless and supping without a bed to follow, with chance for his chef and the ground open to the stars for his lodging. No cloud wandered more than he. Still, amid these painful cross events, two things did not desert him, to wit, his good humor and the manuscript of The Avenger, a tragedy which had made the rounds of all the likely openings for dramatic talent in Paris. But one day, as it befell, Rodolphe, having been conducted to the Jug for a choreographic performance a trifle too weird for public taste, found himself face to face with an uncle, a genuine uncle whom he had not seen for an age, in the shape of one Monetti, a stove manufacturer, an authority on chimneys, and a sergeant in the National Guard to boot. Touched by his nephew's misfortunes, Uncle Monetti promised to mend matters, how we shall presently see, if the ascent of 6 pairs of stairs do not dismay the reader. So let us grasp the handrail and climb. Oof! 125 steps. Here we are. One step more takes us into the room, another would bring us out at the other side. The place is perhaps small, but it is high up, and besides there's good air up there, and a fine view. The furniture consists of a good selection of chimney cowls, a couple of portable stoves, a few patent grates for economizing fuel, especially if no fuel is put in them, a dozen or so of funnels and fire bricks, and a whole host of warming apparatus. Furthermore, to complete the inventory, add to these a hammock slung from a couple of hooks on the walls, a garden chair with an amputated leg, a chandelier still adorned with a solitary socket, and various fancy articles and objects of art. As for the second room, a balcony and a couple of dwarf cypresses in pots convert it into a park for the summer. The tenant of this abode, a young man dressed like a Turk of comic opera, is just finishing his breakfast as we enter, a meal which in itself is a shameless violation of the law of the Prophet, as may be sufficiently seen by the presence of the mortal remains of a knuckle of ham and what was once a full bottle of wine. Breakfast ended, the youthful Turk extended himself on the floor in Oriental fashion, languidly smoking a narghileh marked J.G., and while he gave himself up to a sense of Asiatic beatitude, he passed his hand from time to time over the back of a magnificent Newfoundland dog, who would no doubt have responded to these caresses if he had not been made of earthenware. All at once a sound of footsteps came from the passage, and the door opened to give admittance to somebody who, without a word, went straight up to a range which did duty as a bureau, drew a roll of papers out of the oven, and subjected them to a close scrutiny. "What?" cried the newcomer, speaking with a strong Piedmontese accent. "Have you not finished the chapter on ventilation holes yet?" "With your leave, uncle," replied the Turk. "The chapter on ventilation holes is one of the most interesting in your work, and requires to be studied with especial care. I am now studying it." "Wretched boy! It is always the same thing. And my chapter on hot air stoves, how is that going on?" "The hot air stove is doing well. By the by, uncle, if you would let me have a little firewood, it would not come amiss. It is a small edition of Siberia up here. I am so cold that I have only to look at the thermometer, and it drops below 0. What? Have you burned a whole bundle already?" "With your permission, uncle, there are bundles and bundles, and yours was a very little one. I will send you a block of patent fuel. It keeps the heat in." "That is precisely why it gives none out." "Oh, well, I will send you up a little bundle," returned Monsieur Monetti, as he withdrew. "But I want my chapter on hot air stoves tomorrow." "When the fire comes, it will inspire me," called the Turk, as the key was turned a second time in the lock. If this history were a tragedy, now would be the time to bring in the confidant. His name would be Noureddin or Osman. He would approach our hero with a mixture of discretion and protection in fine and just proportion, and worm his secret out of him with such lines as these. What boding grief, my lord, o'erwhelms you now, and why this pallor on your awful brow? Did Allah's might my lord's designs arrest? Did Ali execute his stern behest, and bear to exile under alien skies the wilful fair whose beauty charmed his eyes? But this is not a tragedy, and in spite of our pressing need of a confidant, we must do without him. Our hero is not what he appears to be. The turban does not make the Turk, and the youth is no other than our friend Rodolphe, received in the abode of his uncle, for whom he is in the act of shaping a manual, the complete guide to chimneys. The fact is that Monsieur Monetti, an enthusiast for his art, had devoted his life to the science of chimney construction, and had even adapted for his own use a maxim which serves in some sort as a pendant to that of Cicero. The stove-maker is born, not made. The worthy Piedmontese would cry in moments of lofty enthusiasm. One day it occurred to him to formulate, for the benefit of future races of man, a theoretical code of the principles of an art, in the practice of which he excelled, his ideas requiring, however, to be put in a setting which should make them generally intelligible. He had, as we have seen, chosen his nephew for the task. Rodolphe was boarded, lodged, and so forth, and on completion of the guide was to receive a premium of 100 crowns. At the outset, and to encourage his nephew to work, Monetti had generously made him an advance of 50 francs. Rodolphe, who had not set eyes on such a sum for nearly a year, was in a fair way to go out of his mind. He issued forth in the company of the coins. For 3 days nothing was seen of him, and forth he returned, alone. Monetti, having hopes of a red ribbon, was in a hurry to see his manual completed. He put his nephew under lock and key for fear of fresh escapades, and the better to keep him to work, took away his clothes, and left instead the disguise in which we have just discovered him. But in spite of all this, the famous guide went on at a jog-trot pace. Rodolphe's genius was absolutely unsuited to literature of that kind. Monetti avenged himself for his nephew's slothful indifference in the matter of chimneys by making him suffer all sorts of hardships, sometimes cutting down his meals, and frequently cutting off tobacco. At length, one Sunday, when Rodolphe had toiled at the chapter on air-holes till his brows were covered with the ink and sweat of anguish, he broke the pen, which made his fingers itch, and went to take a walk in his park. But, as if it had been arranged on purpose to tantalize and exasperate his cravings, he could not so much as glance in any direction without perceiving the countenance of a man with a pipe at every window. On the gilded balcony of a newly built house he remarked a dandy in a dressing-gown chewing the end of an aristocratic Havana. On the floor above sat an artist wafting abroad a fragrant mist of Levantine with an amber mouthpiece. Below, at the window of a public house, a fat German was blowing the froth from a pot of beer in the intervals of puffing like a steam engine at a Cudmer pipe, from which dense clouds arose, and in another direction a knot of working men, their cuddy pipes between their teeth, were walking along, singing on their way to the barrier. Every man in the street, in fact, and there were a good many, was smoking. "Alack!" Rodolphe exclaimed enviously, "at this hour there is not a creature in the world but smokes, save I and my uncle's chimneys." And, leaning his brow on the handrail, Rodolphe meditated upon the bitterness of life. Just then the sound of a prolonged peal of musical laughter came up to him from below. He bent over a little to see whence this burst of merriment proceeded, and perceived that he had been seen by a lodger who occupied the floor immediately beneath, one Mademoiselle Sidonie, a leading lady at the Luxembourg Theatre. Mademoiselle Sidonie came out upon her terrace, rolling between her fingers with Castilian dexterity a tiny roll of light tobacco, which she took from an embroidered velvet pouch. "What a handsome tobacco pouch!" Rodolphe muttered to himself in thoughtful adoration. "Who is that Ali Baba?" Mademoiselle Sidonie wondered, and in her mind she meditated pretexts for beginning a conversation with Rodolphe, who in fact was engaged in a similar mental process. "Oh dear me," exclaimed Mademoiselle Sidonie, as if speaking to herself, "how tiresome! I have no matches." "Will you allow me to offer you some, mademoiselle?" said Rodolphe, and wrapping 2 or 3 matches in a scrap of paper, he let them drop on the balcony. "1,000 thanks," said Sidonie as she lit her cigarette. "Oh heavens, mademoiselle," Rodolphe continued, "may I venture to ask, in return for the slight service which my good angel enabled me to render—" "What? He is asking something already," thought Sidonie, honoring Rodolphe with a closer attention. "Ah, these Turks, they are fickle, people say, but very pleasant." Then, raising her face to Rodolphe's, she said aloud, "Speak, monsieur, what do you want?" "Oh heavens, mademoiselle, I will only beseech a little tobacco of your charity. I have not had a smoke for 2 days, only 1 pipe." "With pleasure, monsieur, but how is it to be done? Will you be so good as to come downstairs?" "Alas, that is quite out of the question. I am a prisoner, but I will make use of such freedom as I have to avail myself of a very simple device." And fastening a string to his pipe, he let it down to the terrace, where Mademoiselle Sidonie abundantly filled it. Then, with deliberate caution, Rodolphe drew it up again without accident. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said, "how much improved my pipe would have been if I could have lighted it at your eyes." An agreeable pleasantry which has reached its 100th edition at least, but Mademoiselle Sidonie thought it none the less superb. "You flatter me," she thought it incumbent upon her to reply. "Oh, mademoiselle, to me you seem lovely as the 3 Graces." Decidedly, thought Sidonie, Ali Baba is very polite. "Are you really a Turk?" she inquired. "Not by vocation, but of necessity. I am a dramatic author, madame." "And I am an actress," returned Sidonie, adding, "Will you do me the honor of dining and spending the evening with me, monsieur?" "Ah, mademoiselle, your proposal opens up all heaven to me, but it is impossible to accept it. I am a prisoner, as I have already had the honor of telling you, locked in by my uncle Monetti, a stove manufacturer, to whom, for the present, I am acting as secretary." "Still you can dine with me," returned Sidonie. "Pay attention to what I am going to tell you. I am about to go back into my room, and I will knock on the ceiling. If you look closely at the spot from which the sound comes, you will find traces of a square hole there, long since closed up. If you can contrive to pull up the board laid across it, we can keep each other company, each in our separate room." Rodolphe set to work at once, and in 5 minutes' time had opened up communication between the 2 chambers. "The hole is small," said he, "yet not so small but that my heart can pass through it." "Now we will dine," returned Sidonie. "Lay the cloth in your room, and I will hand up the dishes." Rodolphe let down his turban by a piece of string and drew it up again, laden with provisions. Then the poet and actress sat down to dinner, the one above, the other below, and while Rodolphe's teeth were busy with the food, his eyes devoured Mademoiselle Sidonie. "Alas, mademoiselle," he remarked, when the meal was over, "thanks to you, the cravings of hunger are satisfied. Will you not do as much for the cravings of my heart, after so prolonged a fast, Poor boy, said Sidonie, and mounting on a piece of furniture, she brought her hand to Rodolphe's lips. He covered it with kisses. Ah, he cried, what a pity that you have not, like Saint Denis, the privilege of carrying your head in your hands. After dinner, a conversation, half sentimental, half literary, sprang up. Rodolphe talked of his Avenger, and Mademoiselle Sidonie asked him to read it aloud. So Rodolphe, hanging over the hole in the ceiling, declaimed his tragedy for the benefit of the actress below, who, the better to hear him, had seated herself in an armchair on top of a chest of drawers. Mademoiselle Sidonie pronounced The Avenger to be a masterpiece, and as she was apt to have her own way at the theatre, she promised Rodolphe that his play should appear. Uncle Monetti's footsteps, light as the tramp of the commandant, broke in upon their discourse at the very tenderest moment. Rodolphe had only just time to put the board back in its place. "Stay," said Monetti, addressing his nephew. "Here's a letter for you. It has been running about after you this month past." "Let us look at it," said Rodolphe. "Oh, uncle," he cried, "I am rich. The letter informs me that I have been awarded a prize of 300 francs by an academy of floral games. Quick, my coat and my things, and let me hie to reap my laurels. They await me at the capital." "And how about my chapter on air-holes?" his uncle retorted coolly. Much that matters. Give me back my things. I'm not going tricked out like this." "You are not going out at all until the guide is finished," said his uncle, as he locked in Rodolphe with a double turn of the key. Left alone, Rodolphe was not long about making up his mind. Tying the bedclothes together, he made one end fast to his balcony railing, and by means of the improvised ladder arriving safely, in spite of the perils of the descent, upon Mademoiselle Sidonie's terrace. "Who is there?" she cried when Rodolphe tapped on the window panes. "Hush," said he. "Let me in." "What do you want? Who are you?" "Can you ask? I am the author of The Avenger, and I have come down to look for my heart, for I let it fall through the hole in your ceiling." "Wretched young man," said the actress, "you might have killed yourself." "Listen to me, Sidonie," Rodolphe went on, showing her the newly received letter. "Fame and fortune are smiling upon me, you see, if only love will do the same." Next morning, Rodolphe contrived to make his escape from his uncle's house by the aid of a masculine disguise which Sidonie found for him, and hurrying away to the representative of the Academy of Floral Games, received a golden eglantine of the value of 100 crowns, a blossom which lived almost as long as roses usually do. A month afterwards, Monsieur Monetti received an invitation of The Avenger. Thanks to Mademoiselle Sidonie's talent, it was performed 17 times and brought in 40 francs to its author. Later still, as it was summertime, Rodolphe took up his abode in the Avenue des Saint Cloud, on the 5th branch of the 3rd tree to the left, as you come from the Bois de Boulogne.